Society of India, ACM, and life member of Indian Static Institute, Microelectronics Society of India, Institute of Electronics and Telecommunication Engineering, and Telemedical Society of India. He is a member of Scientific, Technical, and Editorial Committee of Engineering and Natural Science Division of World Academy of Engineering, Science, and Technology. Sir has received University Gold Medal in his BTech and MTech respectively. Sir has also received 5 Best Paper Awards. Sir has received many awards that include FSAB Award, Young Engineer Award in the year 2012-13 by the Institute of Engineer, Award for the Fellow of Association for the Advancement of Bio-Division Science, VIFA Young Faculty Award by the World Stoke Organization in the year 2015. Sir has published over more than 100 papers in international journals and conferences and also have reviewed many journals. Sir is an associate editor in the Frontier in Public Health and also the member of editorial board of Frontier in Computation Neuroscience. He has been author of 7 books and books chapter. Sir has currently 5 patents and has 2 copyright in the field of non-invasive medical diagnosis and granted 1 US patent in non-invasive brain simulation. His research interest is in field of development of biomedical embedded system, VLSI architecture, near infrared stethoscope based non-invasive diagnosis, and ASIC design of intelligent and signal processing circuits. Sir has keen interest in education system and its necessary information transfer. Sir, it's pleasure for us to be here with us, and sir, we will definitely learn many more things from you, sir. Thank you, sir.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Singh, for an introduction. I don't know whether I deserve so much as introduction or not. So over the next hour and a half or maybe 2 hours, I'll tour you through the different kinds of developmental endeavors we have gone through at primarily IIT Mandi and to some extent at IIIT Hyderabad, because that's where I started my career with. So before that, I would like to share my screen with you. So is my screen visible to all of you?
Yes, sir. Yes, visible.
I mean, so let me give you a brief historic perspective. So when I did my PhD, I worked in the area of high performance embedded systems for medical diagnostic applications, where I tried to use various soft computing algorithms, translated it into architectural designs, and realized it into various generic chip architectures such as FPGA. And but after my PhD, I thought of working more towards the area of sensing of various pathophysiological parameters. And to start with, I started working on a non-invasive estimation of hemoglobin and glucose. And in this process of non-invasive estimation, I started working off with photoplethysmography, which actually uses the notion of near-infrared spectroscopy for the estimation of oxyhemoglobin and deoxyhemoglobin. And from there, we could estimate the concentration of hemoglobin in blood. However, in about 2013 or so, there has been a pivotal change in the direction of my research, where I still continued using near-infrared spectroscopy, but then I started looking more into the problems of or oriented towards neurology, where we started looking at non-invasive diagnostic systems for point-of-care testing of stroke and other cerebral disorders. So over the next uh, hour and a half or maybe 2 hours, we shall be talking about this stroke diagnosis problem only. And again, I would like to say that uh, I would like to make this lecture a very interactive lecture, which means at any point of time, you are free to raise any question and we can discuss and try to, I'll try to, quench your thirst for knowledge. So, so to start off with, I would like to show you the picture of our IIT Mandi South campus. This is actually the half of the campus. The other half is on the other side of this hill. So it's actually a single campus, but there's a ridge in between that actually makes it divisible into South campus and the North campus. So the institute started operating in its permanent campus from the South campus itself and gradually got expanded to the North campus. And so it's actually a 530-acre campus, and it's located somewhere between Mandi and Kulu, about 20 kilometers from the historic town of Mandi and about 40 kilometers from Kulu. So it's basically located somewhere between Mandi and Kulu. So I would like to acknowledge the support lent by my students, whose faces you can see over here, because they are working and I'm talking. And so over time, we try to develop a biomedical systems lab here at IIT Mandi, consisting of some basic monitoring devices, with the help of which we try to estimate various pathophysiological parameters. So now let's start off with our discussion by asking the question, what is diagnosis? Now, diagnosis is, as we all know, is the process of identifying the nature of and cause of anything. Now, when we say diagnosis, it doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be medical diagnosis. I mean, suppose we find out the fault in any circuit, that is also diagnosis. We call it fault diagnosis. Similarly, if we want to diagnose and find out error in a software, that is also one kind of diagnosis. So there can be, and suppose we want to find out some fault in a machine, that is also diagnosis. So diagnosis does not necessarily mean that we want to figure out what problem is there in the human body or human health. However, there is a commonality between all kinds of diagnosis. It is basically a process by which we try to identify the source of any problem, and in the essence, it is actually used to determine the cause-effect relationship. So essentially, there are three important aspects of diagnosis. I have to identify the cause of anything. So identification is one part of it. Then I have to apply some logic, which means I have to need to do some reasoning to establish the cause-effect relationship. And finally, I have to analyze the thing and propose some solutions based on the outcome of diagnosis. So this is identification, logic, and analysis are the three important components of diagnosis. Now, when it comes to medical diagnosis, obviously now the establishment of this cause-effect relationship gets limited to the domain of identification of specific diseases. So here we try to identify the nature and cause of different diseases by identification of its signs and symptoms. So few terminologies are very common with respect to medical diagnosis. It includes clinical diagnosis, which means that when a patient visits a physician, he or she tries to examine the patient and tries to get a gross estimate of what kind of problem the patient is suffering from. So that's the clinical diagnosis. Then one can also think of getting a good number of pathophysiological parameters tested in a pathological laboratory, and based on that, um, some understanding can be developed about the nature of disease of the patient. Similarly, you can use X-ray to figure out whether there is any fracture or defect in the bones or deformations in the bones or not. So that's X-ray diagnosis. Similarly, you can have ECG diagnosis, EEG diagnosis, and so on. Now, if you want to formalize the different steps of diagnosis, then the different steps of diagnosis are as follows. We need to interview the subjects to find out the we need to interview the subject to find out what kind of problem the subject is facing. So typically, when a patient visits a physician, usually a dialogue is set up between the patient and the physician, where the physician keeps on asking a lot of questions to get to know more about the patient's disease or disorder. Then once the patient understands once the patient provides information about the disease, then the physician tries to understand the symptoms related, which the patient is complaining about. And based on that symptoms, the physician also develops an initial understanding about the disease of the patient, and then prescribes a set of tests to the patient to develop more understanding about the nature of problem of the patient. Because occasionally it may not be an intentional thing, but many times it so happens that patients sometimes feel something but does not feel it either comfortable to share it with a physician, or it so happens that the patient knowingly or unknowingly ignores sharing those information, which may be of great use to the physician. And usually, in order to figure out the actual problem in more details, the physician prescribes a set of laboratory tests to be carried out, and based on the test results, the physician puts himself into a clinical thinking process, and based on the outcomes of that clinical thinking, he suggests an appropriate set of therapeutic actions to the patient. Now, usually the symptoms that are referred to are of very subjective kind. Um, Sometimes the symptoms being referred to are more of a physiological kind, where patient has problems like fever, cough and cold, and so on. So in these cases, things like, suppose you have headache or stomach ache, some pain in the head, some pain in the stomach, it is not possible to diagnose and figure out those problems externally. At least it is not visible externally, except for some change in behavior of the subject. Whereas in case of pathological and morphological symptom, there are the symptoms are externally visible. Either you have some boils or rashes or masses developed, or you have some dead skin coming off, whatever. There must be some symptom which is expressed in the form of some external change in the identifying features, and such symptoms are called pathological or morphological symptoms. So now to understand this diagnosis process, we take an example. Let us consider some disease X such that 75% of the disease, 75% of the patients suffering from the disease are curable by means of capsules or pills. 55% of the patients suffering from the disease are curable by means of injection, and 35% of the patients suffering from the disease are curable by means of surgery. Right. Now, don't you think that it appears very strange that usually in practice it's the other way around? We first try to cure a disease with the help of oral medicines, failing which we go to the doctor and the doctor suggests some injections to be taken. If injection also fails, then the third option is to go for a surgery. And here the results are just the opposite. That is, with pills, oral pills, you are getting maximum success, followed by injections, with which the success rate is somewhat in the middle, and the success rate is minimal with the help of surgery. Can you tell me why? Can anyone tell me why is it so? Can anyone tell me why is it so? Any answer?
So we have some answers in the chat box.
Oh my God, this chat box is, let me check. Maybe at the last stage we have to go for surgery. That's not the answer. Any other answer? The problem happened because there are three subtypes of the disease, where the subtype A is most curable with the help of pills. The subtype B is most curable with the help of injections, and subtype C is most curable with the help of surgery. So one thing which we understand is that it is very important to do the classification of the disease into its subtype. Right? For example, telling that somebody is suffering from hepatitis is not sufficient. You have to say that whether it is hepatitis A or B or C or D or E. So here, as you can see that moment I do the classification, subtype A has a success rate of 100% using capsules or pills, subtype C has a success rate of 85% using injections, and subtype B has a success rate of 90% using surgery. So what we infer is that a simple classification of the disease into its subtype could have improved the um, success rate of the disease. So with identification of the subtypes and then curing subtype A with pills, B with surgery, and C with injection, the averaging done, the success rate came up to 91.7%. So the therapeutic success rate improved because of the refined diagnosis. And here we are not developing any new therapies for treating the patient. We just am using the old therapies only. So a higher resolution of dividing the disease into subtypes improves therapeutic success rates. So how do we obtain a higher resolution of a disease that is clinically relevant? One way is we need to record the patient history and profile. Unfortunately, in our country, this history taking of patients is very poorly done. In most cases, we don't have archives of the patient at all in the hospital. And that's why every time a patient appears before a physician, he or she treats the patient as a new arrival. Second thing is stepwise analysis is important. That is, you first apply the most superficial step, then you are unable to make out from that step, then you go to the next step, then you go to the next step, and so on. So that is what we also call differential diagnosis. So that is actually very important to make the diagnosis process clinically relevant. Logical thinking is very important because most of the reasoning that takes place in case of clinical diagnosis is based on some unstructured source of information. Therefore, it is very important that the physician should think elaborately, logically before giving feedback to the subject. Sometimes we stop in the midway, being tired of carrying out tests, but tests are definitely very much needed. So many a times what results are obtained from initial clinical findings may not be very convincing, and in that case, one has to go for further tests. Hence, a plethora of tests are needed for diagnosis. And so what can be the right approach for diagnosis? So traditionally, there are two approaches for diagnosis. One is non-invasive diagnosis and the other one is invasive diagnosis. In case of invasive diagnosis, some part of the body needs to be punctured, some sutured, like biopsy, blood test, and so on. Whereas, so if you consider for invasive diagnosis, there is a pain involved in the patients, and you need to have an expert in the sample collection process. On the contrary, in case of non-invasive diagnosis, there is no suture, no puncture involved, no pain is involved because you are not cutting any finger or so. However, you may need to have an expert sitting beside the subject particularly when it comes to non-invasive techniques like USG, PET scan, and so on, where you need to take help of a very costly device to do the diagnosis. The waveforms come in a manner that is not so easily understood by a layman, and therefore an expert's intervention is needed. Hippocrates was the first person who proposed this notion of medical diagnosis, and he is called the father of medicine. And even today, when students finish their medical undergraduate program, before they graduate, they have to take the Hippocratic Oath. And that is basically composed of collection of 70 different words. Galen was there between 130 BC and 200 BC. His work made significant contribution in the field of anatomy and or physiology. He could identify the arteries, the veins. So his findings paved a great way to the knowledge of brain, spinal cord, and pulse. But then it was only in early 18th century that scientist Lenne from RTH, he used this notion of non-invasive diagnosis by inventing a auscultatory stethoscope. But the stethoscope, which was invented by Lenne, is very different from the stethoscope that we see nowadays. So here is actually the picture for Lenne's stethoscope. So as you can see over here, he's using a long tube to hear the heart sound of this boy. And so he is basically this audio signals due to the heartbeat is passing through the pipe to the other end, and then he could hear the auscultation coming from through the pipe. So this experiment was tried out by Lenne in 1816 and is very popularly known as Lenne's experiment. Not just Lenne inventing the stethoscope, there were a large number of other physicians in the Western world who could invent various devices and techniques. As for example, we have the Leeuwenhoek, who invented the microscope in the 17th century. All of you know that Fahrenheit invented the thermometer in 1724. Similarly, Ludwig invented the hematomanometer in 1847, and Welcher invented the hematinometer. Now, this hematomanometer is very important because it is used for measuring the blood pressure. Thermometer, we all know why it is so important. And microscope is used for identifying the different cells in our body, different organelles within the cells, and so on. So now, when I say non-invasive diagnosis can mean a lot of things. Here, as you can see, that we have a woman sitting and doing this ultrasonography. So it is not fully automatic because the women's intervention is needed for recording the USG signal. Similarly, when it comes to CT imaging, again, you need an expert's intervention besides the subject. In MRI also, here it is for the limb MRI. So again, expert's intervention is needed. So now, for apart from the high cost, a lot of other factors are involved with respect to diagnosis. So one is the high cost. Then sometimes the cost is so high that becomes difficult to implement in rural or areas or block level, especially in the developing countries. The other broad question is that if it is going to be implemented, do the patients visit the healthcare center regularly for scanning or monitoring? So this is true for all of us. Even I'm saying so many things, but I would feel reluctant to go to a physician at periodic intervals. So this has posed a considerable considerable problem to identify the diseases of the patients in time and take appropriate actions. Now, if you consider the scenario of research activities in India, our line of research is inspired by the following factors. Firstly, there are 700 millions of Indians who live in 636,000 villages, out of which only 2% of the doctors stay in the rural areas. 66% of the Indians do not have any access to critical medicine. 31% of the population have to travel for healthcare facilities only. 22 million people are pushed down below the poverty line every year due to healthcare expenditure only. And 40% of the hospitalization expenditure comes from borrowed money or sold assets. However, we must be surprised to know that preventable and curable diseases dominate the morbidity pattern. So the objective of the current work is to develop a low-cost point-of-care testing system. The system should be easy enough to use so that it can be directly operated by the patients themselves or their caregivers who need not be trained experts. Now, when we try to develop these devices for monitoring several diseases, we thought of prioritizing non-communicable diseases such as strokes and other neurological disorders, diabetes, etc. Now, the biggest question that we need to answer is that for communicable diseases, as we all know that this COVID-19 is being spread like an epidemic, and this pandemic is spreading very fast. It's a communicable disease. But things like, say, this stroke, Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, these are all non-communicable diseases, which means that if some person has got stroke, it will not affect other persons, even though they are staying close by. So the ultimate objective is, can we build diagnostic centers at home? Now, I would like to tell you the story of a 12-year-old girl, Abha, who was climbing on a rock in the western part of West Bengal at a place called Mukutmanipur in the Bankura district. And she had to be rushed all the way to Kolkata so for a CT scan, and the worst thing that happened is that by the time the scan happened, the problem is detected, the girl already had left this world for the other world. And however, a simple scan on time could have saved her life. So this is basically the location of the hemorrhage. Now, because of this hemorrhage, there is a eruption. There is a stoppage in the supply of oxygen to the cells and tissues in the gray matter, and you can see the image of the hemorrhage in this picture. Now, if the scan would have been done earlier, she could have been saved. Now, Abha's case is not the only case. If you compare India with its comparable peers, then India is in a very bad situation with respect to such kinds of scanners. Currently, India has an abundance of 1 MRI scanner per million of population. It is one of the lowest in the world. So this data I have got from my friend Abhijit. So he actually published his work in the Neurology Journal in 2012. So now if you do the math, you will see that the number of neurological disorders being reported for is exponentially increasing over time. About 3.5 million people are getting affected because of this epidemic. If you do the math, it comes out to be 11,000 people per day, and then again further when you do, it refers to 7 people per minute. It is not just limited to the Eastern world or in the developing countries. Even when you go to the Western world, there many a times some problem happens in the head and people think that it's the case of a headache, and they typically give them some sedative with which they go to bed and have a sound sleep. But here we take the case of one lady. Her name is Anita Trevik. She had brain hemorrhages in the month of December, and she could not be saved because she was misdiagnosed at the beginning, and had she been diagnosed correctly, she could have been saved. So what I want to say is that this misdiagnosis of neurological emergencies are very common. So essentially, what we see is this cognitive impairment is associated with stroke, stress, anxiety, and depression. So as you can see over here, the person has got, if you have some stroke, it actually causes some cognitive impairment. And because of this cognitive impairment, there is a possibility that a person suffers from anxiety. And similarly, because of cognitive impairment, it will cause a change in stress. And similarly, it will cause depression as well. Now, the global burden of diseases, or GBD, in 2015, they carried out a survey and reported that there is around 15% of disability-adjusted life years, or DALYs, globally increased in between 2005 to 2015 due to mental disorders. In 2016, worldwide neurological disorders are considered to be one of the common cause of disability and second leading cause of death. Globally, around 11.6% of Delhi's and 16.5% of deaths were reported due to all type of neurological disorders. Amongst the neurological disorders, stroke, epilepsy, migraine, they are very common. The preliminary studies related to COVID-19 reported that there is 8% reported stress cases and 16 to 28% symptoms of anxiety and depression cases, which may be caused due to depression in sleep or unbalanced lifestyle of individuals. Now, if you see the homeostasis operating over here, the neuron in the brain, or more specifically the gray matter, the astrocyte, the blood vessel, and the microglia, they form a homeostatic system where the impulses received by the neuron are transferred via astrocytes to the blood vessels and vice versa. And now when you give a stimulus, if the neurovascular unit and gets overexcited, the excitation is transferred to the astrocyte, and in the process, in order to bring back the normalcy, the astrocyte reduces the supply of oxygen and nutrients, and then it balances the neurotransmitter or neurohumor system. Now within the cell, what is happening is one has to maintain a balance of the excitation inhibition ratio. Potassium ion concentration is supposed to remain constant. On the other hand, with the increase in neuronal activity, there is an increase in oxygen consumption. And in the process, because of the increase in neuronal activity, lots of ions are discharged, which goes to the perivascular space or smooth muscles lining the perivascular space, which leads to the dilation of the blood vessel. Sometimes, for example, cathodal transcranial direct current stimulation can lead to constriction of the blood vessel, and therefore less blood can flow through the blood vessel. So essentially, the lumen of the cerebrovascular artery or mid-cerebral artery is controlled by the potassium ions that are released from the sensory neurons via astrocytes. Now, if you see the global technology map, then a lot of devices have come up to provide non-invasive diagnosis at the point of care. You have a glucometer, you have patient vitals monitor, then you have the physiology kit to monitor the monitor various pathophysiological parameters. A lot of these devices can be integrated at different parts of the body where they need not be implanted. They can just be on contact with the different parts of the body. They sense various parameters and then takes appropriate, gives appropriate decision, which actually guides the physician to take necessary actions based on the decisions being provided. So if you take the case where oxygen saturation of blood, hemoglobin, glucose, blood pressure, blood urea, blood creatinine, blood proteins like albumin, globulin, all of these parameters can be estimated by these non-invasive point-of-care testing devices. But we do not have any such technology available for the brain that can reach the point of care. Now, I have actually a theory for this problem. given that patients are so much reluctant to visit the diagnostic centers, why not the diagnostic center reach the patients? So it's basically the opposite way of thinking. So that actually brings us to the notion of point of care testing. So if I go by the definition from the College of American Pathologists, it basically refers to uh, tests that are designed to be used at or near the site where the patient is located, that do not require permanent dedicated space and that are performed outside the physical facilities of clinical laboratories. That means you don't really need any formal ultra clean environment for performing this point of care testing, but rather with uh, with such a point of care testing support, you can do a wide variety of testing uh, and obtain appropriate results for medical diagnosis. Now, if you see the sequence of development of testing techniques over time, uh, the whole scenario of medical diagnosis is gradually shifting towards the area of non-invasive diagnosis. So, so from a highly complex, more formal setting in a hospital or patholab um, or office, office lab, whatever, it is now going to something like a house or a room within the house, whatever, and there you do not have so much restrictions to follow. You can get the general idea about most of the pathophysiological parameters um, with nearly the same result as that of the um, conventional approach, but uh, of course you may also lose something in terms of accuracy. So accuracy is still a big challenge with respect to these point of care testing devices. So one of the things which we worked first was the hat or a cap. This cap you can see over here, which is basically used for capturing the cerebrovascular reactivity, and from there we could predict and figure out the subject, whether the subject is suffering from stroke or not. So what we did, we actually took a central anode and multiple cathodes surrounding it. So this anode and cathodes are used for providing anodal transcranial direct current stimulation. And now, why do we really need to give this anodal transcranial direct current stimulation? So again, if you see this figure in the middle, so when you take the signal from the cerebrovascular artery or mid-cerebral artery, the signal to noise ratio is very low, and therefore the signal has to travel through several layers before it is available at the surface. So here what we did is we modeled the brain as a fourth order control system, where two orders are coming with respect to the transformation in signals happening at the scalp site, and then two layers are happening because of the transmembrane current and subarachnoid space, cerebrospinal fluid, skull and scalp. So so based on the signal, based on the needs signals being obtained, which is essentially the HB and HbO2, if you add them up together, you can get the total concentration of hemoglobin. Now, over here, if you see in this graph, this is actually the plot of oxyhemoglobin, and this is the plot of the deoxyhemoglobin, and this is actually the plot of the total hemoglobin. So the total hemoglobin essentially is the sum total of oxy and deoxyhemoglobin. And now here, if you see the trend of the hemoglobin, so this is actually the uh, total. I mean, this is actually the what we simulated using the uh, basic equation, starting off with Curl-Friston's equation for flow of first order flow of blood within the artery, and then using that we coupled it with the model for oxyhemoglobin and deoxyhemoglobin concentration, and then we could do an estimation of the instantaneous concentration of hemoglobin in blood, and then we found that to be quite close enough with respect to the measured value of oxyhemoglobin and deoxyhemoglobin. Now, why we did this experiment? So essentially, we were trying to find out the instantaneous cerebral oxygenation level. So if the now what we found out is that prior to occurrence of stroke, there is either constriction developed in the cerebrovascular artery or some kind of uh, a plaque developed in the cerebrovascular artery which prevents the flow of blood, and therefore the supply of oxygen and nutrients via blood to the different cells in the brain, particularly specifically the gray matter, is disturbed. So if the so for the particular area where we are doing the testing, if the testing area is a uh, lesion site, then even after giving the anodal transcranial direct current stimulation, you will not see any um, boost up of the signal to noise ratio. Whereas if you give a anodal transcranial direct current stimulation, then you can see a tremendous boost up of the signal to noise ratio. Um, so, so which can be used as a biomarker to classify between a normal subject and a stroke subject. So we actually developed this in our lab, and we tried it out on subjects at the Institute of Neurosciences, Kolkata University of Medicine, Göttingen, Germany, Charité University of Medicine, that's also in Germany, and so on. Now, one of the problem with respect to this non-invasive estimation of parameters is that the signal passes through different layers of skin, and therefore there will be a significant amount of error with respect to the distortion happening in the different layers of the skin. So the other problem is not just the distortion, but because of the roughness of the surface of the skin, there will be too much of scattering happening for some subjects. So what we thought of doing is we basically tried to theoretically model the surface roughness profile of the skin using the Gaussian model and the Rayleigh model, and we found that our skin eruptions typically follow the Rayleigh model, and it's I'm sorry, I had an urgent call. I had to attend it. I'm extremely sorry. Meanwhile, you have any question, please? No question. Okay. So what we did, we basically went by this Rayleigh and Rixian models, Gaussian models, to see what is the kind of surface roughness profile. And we found that our skin follows the Rayleigh distribution, and then we actually used the notion of Rayleigh-Rice scattering theory to figure out the optimal orientation of NIR, LED, and photodetector with respect to the surface of the skin, where we would find out the optimal location to illuminate the skin so that we can get maximum output from it. So we did our studies on large number of patients, and we got promising results when we changed the alignment of the LEDs and photodetectors with respect to the surface of the skin. Now, one of the problem that was we found is that if we use this while doing this near infrared spectroscopy of the brain, we had to use this transcranial direct current stimulation to dilate the cerebrovascular artery, and in the process we found that there was too much of arterial dilation, and at the same time, when we were giving the stimulation using a typical sponge electrode, we could see that the electric field was distributed over a large area. So the problem is that the stroke may be restricted to a small area of the brain, whereas the electric field is distributed over a large area. So which means that you are unnecessarily providing electric field to a part of the brain where you do not need it to provide. And more than that, it may also cause unnecessary constriction or dilation of the walls of the arteries and arterioles in those regions. So instead of using the conventional sponge electrode, we thought of using a sponge electrode. So you can see we thought of using high definition transcranial direct current stimulation electrode. So you can see that here using this silver chloride HDTDCS electrode, now you can see that the focality of stimulation is increased much more. So as compared to a stimulation with a sponge electrode, which you can see over here, the focality of stimulation is increased tremendously with the help of HDTDCS electrode. We actually used silver chloride electrodes with conductive gel paste, and then we found that the focality increased greatly. But then the question is that on analyzing, we found that the stimulation reaches the gyri of the cerebral cortex and not the sulci. So if you see the surface of the cerebral cortex, it is actually thrown into several folds like this. This actually gives rise to these hills and valleys. The hills are called the gyri of the cerebral cortex. The valleys are called sulci of the cerebral cortex. And we found that the stimulation is reaching the gyri of the cerebral cortex and not reaching the sulci of the cerebral cortex. So what we did, we thought of going back to the basic physics. So as you all know that we can use this notion of fringing electric fields. So what we thought of doing is that we can use silver chloride electrodes But then instead of just using a normal silver chloride on the surface, we thought of making some nano spikes on the top of the silver chloride layer. And the advantage is that it can now generate fringing electric field such that this fringing electric field will reach to the sulci of the cerebral cortex. And then initially we worked with silver chloride. Later on we actually modified the silver, replaced the silver with gold and platinum, and we found much better results with gold silver chloride and platinum silver chloride electrodes. And then what we found is that we did the conductivity measurement, and we found that the stimulation is reaching even the cerebrospinal fluid. If the stimulation is reaching the cerebrospinal fluid, then it must be passing through skull, white matter, and other areas, which means that, and scalp sites as well, which means that it is reaching must reach the sulci of the cerebral cortex. So this is actually how we did the trials on rats. So we did the rat trials at IHPT Palampur after completing the formalities of Animal Ethics Committee of IHBT Palampur. And then you can see this. This is actually a gold silver chloride electrode. So this is actually the gold. This is the silver chloride. So the silver chloride is brought in direct contact with the surface, whereas the gold is brought in direct contact with the metal. I mean metallic conductor. So so these electrodes were integrated with our Activa Dose 2 TDCS device, and then we found that our results improved tremendously with respect to improving the focality of stimulation, as well as ensuring that the stimulation reaches the sulci of the cerebral cortex. Next, it is very important to classify the kind of stroke. Now, you know that once a stroke happens, many a times it becomes extremely difficult to survive the stroke patient. So, so what we found is there are two kinds of stroke. One is called the ischemic stroke, and the other one is called the hemorrhagic stroke. So stroke is essentially a sudden disruption in the supply of oxygen and glucose via blood to the cells in the brain because of formation of some obstacle or plaque in the cerebrovascular artery, or because of development of some puncture or rupture in the cerebrovascular artery, because of which blood cannot reach to the point. So you can consider the situation with respect to a tube with water flowing through it. In one case, you have mud or soggy stuff in the tube, and you have to apply some Dranex in the tube to resume the normal flow of blood. In other case, you have to apply some kind of MSIL or whatever on the rupture site to block the gushing out of water and resume the normal flow of water. So ischemic stroke is analogous to the case with the Dranex, where you're applying Dranex to the pipe to remove the clogging stuff and resume the normal flow of water. whereas hemorrhagic stroke is comparable with the case of rupture in the pipe and you are applying Drain-X. So in practice, in case of ischemic stroke, we apply a medicine that is called recombinant tissue plasminogenic activator, or RTPA, which has to be applied within 4 hours of occurrence of stroke if we really want to survive the individual. So in that case, uh, you are applying the medicine to dissolve the coagulation of blood and resume the normal flow of blood. In the other case, you're applying medicine to coagulate the blood at the rupture point and block the gushing out of blood at the rupture point. So given that the pharmacokinetics of treatment of these two kinds of stroke are just the opposite, therefore, it is very important not just to identify whether the patient is suffering from stroke or not, but also to identify whether the patient is suffering from ischemic or hemorrhagic stroke. So we actually did our work with respect to classifying between ischemic and hemorrhagic stroke. And then we found that we can use this change in cerebral oxygenation level as a biomarker. In case of ischemic stroke, the fall in the cerebral oxygenation level is a much more gradual process, whereas in case of hemorrhagic stroke, the fall in the cerebral oxygenation level is a certain process. And therefore, from that, we can be able to, if we monitor the cerebral oxygenation level over a period of time, we can be able to monitor whether the patient is suffering from ischemic or hemorrhagic stroke. Now, once a stroke happens, the next thing is to apply non-invasive brain stimulation for the therapeutic purposes. And in this regard, you need to apply the transcranial stimulation. Transcranial stimulation can be of two types: transcranial electric stimulation and transcranial magnetic stimulation. For diagnosis, for cerebral diagnosis purposes, we can use several techniques like EEG or electroencephalogram, magnetoencephalogram, uh, near-infrared spectroscopy, magnetic resonance imaging, functional magnetic resonance imaging, functional near-infrared spectroscopy, and so on. But once the diagnosis is done, the next step is to do the rehabilitation. Now, when the stroke happens, there is a significant amount of cognitive disorder that has been noticed with respect to anxiety, depression, dementia, and so on. And therefore, people have found out ways by which such disorders can be circumvented. So, what people have found out is that significant improvement has been found out in terms of cognitive performance of surviving patients suffering from neurological diseases such as stroke, Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, and so on, after giving this transcranial direct current stimulation. It can be used to boost up the recovery process post-stroke. In fact, giving stimulation over 3 weeks post-stroke can lead to an individual almost regaining normal life after stroke. So, so that is why this transcranial direct current stimulation has come up as a very popular technique alongside the diagnosis of stroke. So, while for a normal stimulation, we typically use 2x2, 3x3, or 4x4 centimeter square electrode, sponge electrode. Here in HDTDCS, we typically use 1x1 centimeter square ring or disc electrode, and we typically use gel base for the electrode to ensure that the electrodes adhere to the surface of the scalp. So, so we actually computed the electric fields for multi-electrode HDTDCS configuration and found out the optimal location for placement of these electrodes based on statistical techniques to figure out the specific locations where the electrodes could be placed for getting the maximum benefits of this HDTDCS. And then we actually use these electrodes for providing stimulation to the surface of an individual. So we got this work actually published in the IEEE Sensors last year, where we found that the stimulation could reach to the gyri of the cerebral cortex, which also proves a very high focality for the device. Now, in order to see whether this stimulation improves the behavioral response of the individual or not, we actually did some trials with rats, where we basically carried out 4 different kinds of tests on the rats. That is open field test, force swing test, novel object recognition test, and sucrose preference test. So here in the figure, you can see one such test, that is the novel object recognition test. So you can see that initially these 2 cylinders were kept in the box containing the rat, and the rat was made to familiarize with these 2 cylinders for first 8 days. Then we suddenly replaced this rat with this pyramid, and then exposed the rat to this new setting. And then we found that the rat was considerably stressed with the new finding. And so this again, once the rat was stressed, it actually was encountering depression, in which it didn't move that much and mobility was very minimal. And in order to understand the effect of transcranial direct current stimulation to take care of this depression, we provided transcranial direct current stimulation to these rats. Instead of this 4x1 HDTDCS, for a rat, we scaled it down to 1x1 HDTDCS. And here you can see the EEG waveform. So this is actually for the healthy rat. This red line actually indicates, green line indicates for the depression-like behavior with minimal amplitude, whereas this brown spikes indicate the peaks of EEG amplitude after giving the HDTDCS. Now, if you compare the average power of the EEG signal, the average power significantly increased after the application of the HDTDCS dose. We also measured the serotonin level and found a significant rise in the serotonin level once the HDT-DCS dose is given. Now, in terms of the hormones which play a significant role with respect to respect to our excitatory and inhibitory behavior, the glutamate, which is responsible for our excitatory behavior, was analyzed for the rat. So what we did after we did the non-invasive test on the rat, we sacrificed the rat and took out the brain, and then we actually exposed it, took out the cerebral cortex and the hippocampus of it. And then from the cortex, we actually, both from the cortex and the hippocampus, we found that after giving the HDT-DCS dose, the glutamate level got increased, which means that after the rats were depressed and they were exposed to this HDT-DCS, their excitement level increased, whereas the GABA level decreased after application of single dose HDT-DCS, which means that their inhibitory response decreased after application of this HDT-DCS. So this actually brought us to one very important concept that is based on the notion of this patient-specific non-invasive brain stimulation. So we did this work long back, and still we are carrying on this work. So we initially started off with the cortical neural mass model, and so the cortical neural mass model consisting of excitatory pyramidal neurons, slow inhibitory interneurons, fast inhibitory interneurons. They were integrated with the thalamic neural mass model consisting of the excitatory thalamocortical neuron and inhibitory reticular thalamus, and then we found out the EEG of it. Then this cortical neural mass model and the thalamic neural mass model were integrated into a thalamocortical model consisting of the excitation inhibition hypothesis. And then we found out the spectrogram of the EEG signal, where we found out that there was a significant rise in the alpha band of the EEG signal after application of the TDCS, and also some expression in the beta band, even for a resting state EEG, which means that there is a significant amount of excitation happening. So this actually gave us to propose this hypothesis that to have a closed loop control of non-invasive brain stimulation, where we can have a neuronal network, blood vascular network, and the astrocytic network working in close tandem and supported with the help of NIRS and EEG. So we actually extract this NIRS and EEG from the EEG signals from the brain, and then based on the estimation of this NIRS and EEG signal, we tune the duration of stimulation and the ramp up and ramp down time and the amplitude of stimulation to actually control the lumen of the cerebrovascular artery, as well as the excitation and inhibition level of the cortical neurons. So this work was published in the Frontiers in Neurology in 2017, and of late we have come up with this device for of late we have come with this device for non-invasive brain stimulation, and This is actually the HDTDCS device which we have developed in our lab, which is actually used for providing the 4x1 HDTDCS. You can see the measurement system, measurement setup as well. Now comes the business of integrating the stroke diagnostic system with the IoT, I mean the network. So as you know, there are lots of places in Himachal that are very remotely connected. Here you can see the places of Lahul Spiti district, which are really very remote in the Himachal. So, and not only just the Lahul Spiti district, there are many places in Chamba, Kangra, and even Kulu and Mandi districts that are very remote and very difficult to be reached. So what is done is that as of now, there are 2 tertiary healthcare centers in Himachal and about 12 secondary healthcare centers. Now we have neurologists sitting only in these tertiary healthcare centers, but the secondary healthcare centers have got some basic CT scan facilities, with the help of which if a stroke patient is rushed over there, he or she can be diagnosed, and at the same time they can be told whether he or she has got an ischemic or a hemorrhagic stroke. So this has actually given a big advantage, that is, once the stroke is diagnosed, you can immediately, kind of stroke is diagnosed, you can immediately identify whether a recombinant tissue plasminogenic activator is to be given or coagulant has to be given, and based on that the life can be saved. See, once the first aid is given, then the neuro rehabilitation process, which is a thorough and prolonged process, that can go on at its own pace. That is not the problem. The critical thing is that you have those 3 golden hours to save an individual. So you have to diagnose and give the right medicine within those 3 golden hours. Otherwise, the patient will die. Side by side, our work with the non-invasive brain stimulation, we also, and also the diagnosis of stroke, we worked with the detection of traumatic brain injury at the point of care. So here actually we developed a device to detect the traumatic brain injury at the point of care, and we could correctly identify the whether the first patient has got traumatic brain injury or not. This is another work which we are currently doing, which has got, as of now, no relevance with the brain, but down the line we are going to integrate it with the cerebral diagnosis. That is, we are trying to use a portable device for estimating the concentration of albumin in urine. So what we are doing, we have developed a dye at our lab, chemistry lab at IIT Mandi, which is actually an NIR dye. This dye binds only with albumin. So so that is actually the selectivity of this dye. So the selectivity happens. The selectivity happens to remove only with albumin in urine, where the dye binds with albumin in urine, and whereas it is not responsive to other parameters of urine. So so here actually what happens is that when you estimate the concentration of albumin in urine, you put the urine and the dye in a cuvette, as you can see from this figure. Now this dye gets bound to the dye molecules get bound to the albumin molecules in urine, and this this albumin dye complex can be excited by a near infrared radiation of wavelength 740 nanometer, and in turn the molecule releases radiation at a wavelength of 790 to 810 nanometer with a peak at 806 nanometer. And so essentially the absorption spectrum is separate from the emission spectrum. So we are actually using this to estimate the concentration of albumin in urine. And given that the absorption spectrum is different from the emission spectrum, if we optically filter out the absorption, the incident radiation with an optical filter, then we can clearly estimate what is the concentration of albumin in urine by looking at the concentration of albumin in the by looking at the concentration of looking at the radiation output with the help of a photodetector. So we have got a very good response using human serum albumin as well as bovine serum albumin, and now we are actually doing testing with human urine samples, and we have got some promising results with it. And now coming to the business, that is what has it got to do with our research in brain. So in ischemic stroke, there is something called ischemia modified albumin. That is, there is a localized increase in concentration of albumin around the ischemia site. So you can actually figure out you can actually figure out whether it is possible that there is an excess concentration of albumin in a particular location of the brain where you are suspecting some stroke has happened, to see whether there is an excess concentration of albumin, and from there you can estimate the concentration of albumin and figure out whether ischemic stroke has happened or not. So this can be another biomarker apart from the cerebral, degradation in the cerebral oxygenation level, which I have already presented to you before. So in this work, we are trying to develop a low-cost, low magnetic field MRI, but this MRI has a special feature. It does not have any permanent magnet or a superconducting magnet in it. Rather, it has got a Helmholtz coil in it that actually minimizes the size of the MRI greatly and the weight of the MRI greatly. So we actually try to develop a system consisting of Helmholtz coil, Maxwell coil, and saddle coil, and apart from that, RF coil, with the help of which we could estimate, we could do the scanning. So we have started scanning of a leaf with the MRI, and this is the MR scan of the leaf. So this project was actually supported by our BioX consortium of 3 institutes taken together, and still it is going on. The whole objective is to come up with a portable MRI, not portable, at least transportable MRI, which can be transported to the point of care, so that using an ambulance or so that any patient suffering from stroke or other disorders can be diagnosed at the point of care using this MRI, or even for traumatic brain injury individuals, the subject can be diagnosed at the point of care, and based on that, decisions can be taken. Coming to the conclusion, we have tried to develop a non-invasive stroke diagnostic system for the point-of-care testing of patients, a system for classification of stroke versus normal patients have been developed. The stroke diagnostic system is currently extended for further classification of strokes into ischemic and hemorrhagic strokes. The future plan is to further classify the ischemic strokes, whether it is of thrombotic or embolic origin. Then we need to also classify find out, develop this low-cost MRI for diagnosis of strokes as well as traumatic brain injuries in the cerebral cortex. Finally, we are developed an albumin estimation system for estimating the concentration of albumin in urine, and which can be extended for non-invasively estimating the ischemia modified albumin in vivo, so as to provide an additional biomarker for ischemic stroke diagnosis. So in case of diagnosis, as I said, that as more and more you introduce biomarkers, you are more and more specific about the particular kind of disease you have. And that is the reason why we thought of going for so many diagnostic devices, so many biomarkers for classifying between ischemic and hemorrhagic stroke at the point of care, so that the right medicine can be given to the individual and the life can be saved. So these are our collaborators. I acknowledge the support lent by our collaborators. And so that brings an end to my lecture. Should you have any question, please feel free to ask.
Any query? Participants, if any participant have any query, they can ask. Thank you, sir, for this wonderful session, sir. It's a matter of proud for all of us to know that Indian engineering field is at its pinnacle, and they have made a stamp in the field of clinical research. So you and your team has made us proud, and you have strengthened this work. It's a really great service to the mankind, which you and your team is doing, and I, Pushpen Singh, along with our team and from all the members from Government Women Engineering College, would like to thank you and would love to learn and hear many more from you, sir. Thank you, sir. Thank you very much, sir.
Okay, so thanks for inviting me to share my work, and I have already shared my email ID. So this is my email ID. If you have any question, please feel free to drop me an email, and I will be more than happy to answer them.
Yes, sir. Definitely, sir.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, sir. Thank you very much, sir. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you, participant. We'll meet you again tomorrow as per the scheduled time. Thank you. पंकज सर साइन ऑफ कर दें.
हाँ ठीक है बस.